welcome back to The London Architect. This is our second episode, and we have with us today Sam Selencky, who is a director at Selencky Parsons. How are you today, Sam?
Yeah, very good, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
First of all, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your partnership that you obviously have with David, is it? Your friend from university.
Yep.
How did that come about?
So we basically met at university. So we both went to Manchester University and kind of met day one, actually in the queue to register for the course, and then been friends since then, basically. And we did our part one at Manchester together, and then for a year out, we came down to London, lived together there, working for different practices, but kind of did our year out there, and then went back to Manchester again to do part two. And then once we kind of finished uni, we worked at different places, but stayed good friends, and then did kind of some competitions and in our kind of spare time every now and again.
What sort of competitions?
Just kind of random RIBA competitions, or just anything that kind of caught our eye as being quite an interesting thing. So one we did, someone wanted like to create a little kind of building, or like a temporary building to so you could kind of look at a building site that was happening in an interesting way. So we kind of designed this kind of periscope thing. It was never ever going to get built, but it was quite a good fun thing to do. So we did kind of a few of those, but we'd always kind of talked about in the pub of one day it'd be great to set up our own practice and stuff.
Was this at uni?
No, this was kind of after uni.
Yeah.
But once, we've been kind of working for other practices for a while. And then, so I guess I worked for a practice called Patel Taylor. David worked for a practice called Arup Associates. And between us, we kind of did lots of different sectors of work. So we kind of covered a lot of ground. So whether it's offices or sports stadiums or schools or kind of landscape projects or housing. So, and then after we kind of both been working for like 10 years after uni, and then we kind of decided that we talked about doing it, setting up for ages. I ended up getting the opportunity to design a house called the River House, which ended up being our first project, and kind of did that whilst I was still working full time, but just in kind of evenings, lunchtimes, weekends.
Yeah.
And then it eventually got planning, and it had the opportunity to then kind of do the detailed design and actually build this thing. But that would have been kind of too much to try and do in my spare time. So I had a decision to make whether I kind of let it go or maybe use this as a springboard to try and start up a business. And David was actually working in China at the time, in Shanghai, and he'd been there for 2 or 3 years, and he was kind of ready to move back to England. So it all kind of aligned, and we just we kind of made the decision, both quit our jobs and went for it, basically.
Wow.
And we kind of, it was quite a cool house, and we thought, once this is built, we'll definitely get loads of work off the back of this. And that didn't quite happen, but we'd already made the leap at that point. So we kind of had to make it work. And
I've looked at some of the photos of River House, and it's very like distinctive. Like it's a really cool design. What was the sort of philosophy behind the design?
So there's a few things really. So it was a bungalow. There was like a 70s bungalow that used to sit on the site. And it's quite an interesting site. It's a really long, thin site that's kind of on the road at one end, and the other end of the garden kind of backs onto the River Thames. But it was technically classed as being in Greenbelt, which is a kind of planning designation, which means can be tricky to get planning for buildings. But because there was already a building there, we could kind of use that as a basis. But there was, and each council works in a different way, but the South Oxford Council that we worked with for that one, there was a maximum volume that we were allowed to use for that site. So because the river house has got a series of flat roofs rather than pitched roofs, which meant that we could have more floor area for the for the equivalent volume essentially. But it was also a tricky site in that there's not really much else around it. So it's there's no kind of, it wasn't like a Victorian street or kind of old stone cottages or anything. It was just a collection of kind of 70s bungalows, none of which really had much character to them. And the landscape was there, it was quite flat. So the kind of flat roofs and the kind of the different planes that were going on there worked quite well with the surroundings and the landscape. And then we also introduced quite a lot of water into the scheme as well. So even though the house was actually quite far away from the river, we wanted to kind of bring the river almost closer to the house. So you enter it through, and also in another way that another kind of trick almost to get some more floor area, because the bungalow wasn't very big and they wanted to create a kind of 5-bedroom house. So we created a basement underneath it as well. So for planning, the planners, that didn't count as area because it was below ground.
Yeah.
But we wanted to have bedrooms down there, so we didn't want it to be a really dark and dingy space.
Of course,
to get around that, we created this really big light well at the front of it, to kind of get light really far into the plan, but then also filled that with water as well. So you get this really nice kind of light that reflects off the water into the rooms.
That sounds amazing.
And then it also creates this kind of interesting entrance space. So you don't just enter across a footpath, you enter across a little bridge across the water feature basically, and then the water kind of, there's this like weir that kind of falls down into the lower light well. So right from the beginning, before you even enter the building, you've got this kind of sense of water. And then at the back, there's a swimming pool which kind of the ground floor is all kind of flush with the outside, and it runs out into a swimming pool. And there was also this kind of narrow rill that had, again, moving water through it, so you get this kind of sound of water everywhere as well.
So did these ideas mainly come from you? Because you said David was in China at the time. Then did he join at a later point?
He did, yeah. So up until planning, it was kind of me working on it on my spare time, basically. And then then we ended up getting it built. So at that point, it was mostly me involved in it. I showed him some of the some of the designs I was working on at the time, and got some feedback from him and things. But it was at that point it was mostly me. And then once we kind of after that formally started, then we kind of have both been involved in all the projects since. Really.
How would you sort of balance the work in Selencky Parsons? Does one of you take on a certain role, or do you share that evenly? Yeah. So I guess. People have kind of complementary skills where one person is more technical and one does more design, but that's not the way it kind of works for us. I think we both kind of do everything really. So so we both do the technical design. We both are involved in all the kind of design reviews. It's something that works well for us, and it keeps us. I think we're both quite similar, so I guess it can work well if you kind of you're kind of opposites and have different skills that complement each other. We're both quite similar, and so have similar set of skills, but it still seems to work well for us anyway. Do you encourage that sort of high energy, high pace like work environment with the rest of your employees? Yeah, so I think we try to encourage everybody as much as possible to kind of, chip in with ideas, and, the same for us. When we have lots of design reviews. When we were smaller, it would be, so we're kind of 8 people now, but when we were smaller, everybody would be in all the design reviews, and we try and get as much input as possible, because you never know where the good idea is going to come from. Yeah. We don't shoot anyone down there's no such thing as a stupid comment. So try and when people first join, I think they may be slightly reluctant about saying the wrong thing or something. But
hopefully quite quickly we can get over that. And so you never know where the right answer is going to come from, or where an interesting idea is going to come from. And even if somebody comes up with an idea and actually that idea is not the thing, but it sparks another idea in someone else that maybe is the thing that moves forward, that kind of really works. So by the time you get a building on site, it's difficult to know whose idea it was. So it's a blend of lots of different ideas that have kind of come together.
Yeah.
And there's always a lot of options as well. So we never just go, especially with the residential projects, we never just go, right, this is the design, take it or leave it. Because there's always different ways of doing things. Yeah. And there's kind of pros and cons to different things. And a lot of it is very subjective as well. So ultimately, we're not designing houses for ourselves. It's for someone else to live in. So it's good to try and get them involved in the process as well. Yeah. So they kind of feel like it is their house, not a house that we're giving to them, essentially. Yeah.
So I think you mentioned before that you have 8 or 9 employees in your firm. So what's like, how much experience do you normally want like a new employee to have? Do you accept people straight out of university or?
So all different ranges basically. So we've got quite a good mix, and we try and keep that going of kind of people with more experience and people kind of fresh out of university. Yeah. And I think that that works really well. So at the moment we've got part 1 who is with us, who's kind of, they've done their 3-degree university degree, so he's on his year out, and then we've got a range of people from kind of part 2s, so they've done their second part of the course, or there's one at the moment who's with us who is doing their part 2 at the moment, so they're still at university but they're working part-time with us while they study to do their part 2.
So you accept some who have done their part 1, who are taking a year out, and they'll work with you and then go back and do their part 2.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So in theory they're there for a year, but quite often they stay for a bit longer. Yeah. Because there's no set time frame for how you can do longer than 12 months in the industry before you go back if you want to.
And do they often come back to you again after they've completed their part 2?
So Ella, for example, who's with us at the moment, so she did up her part 1 with us, and she's back doing her part 2, and so she's kind of working part-time for us, while she also is doing a university degree. And and we've had other people as well who've done part 1 and then come back to do part 2 with us as well. So that definitely happens. But then we also have kind of people who are doing their part 3, which is your professional qualification. So we've had lots of people that have done that with us. Ellen just got hers the other weeks, and then we have kind of more people who, more experience, who've been architects for a few years.
But you also do some continued professional development within your own firm, right? And how do you sort of? I think you mentioned before that it can get a bit dry sometimes with the sort of things that you have to bring in. How do you keep that exciting?
So CPD is something that we have to do. So to be a RIBA registered practice or an RIBA architect, you have to do a minimum number of hours a year of CPD sessions anyway. We try and use, and that doesn't have to be just a 1-hour lunchtime presentation. Things like lectures and visiting buildings can also count for that. So I think that's another thing that we try and do quite a lot of. So going to see other architects giving lectures is
where can you do that?
So a variety of places. So the RABA has loads of them, which they host at their own building in Portland Place. And then some of the bigger name architects also do other places. So the Royal Academy has some, Barbican has some as well. And that's quite a cool thing to do. It's, getting to see how under the skin of other architects and what their kind of thought processes are and how they kind of got where they are is kind of always a really good thing to do, to kind of spur you on and think of different it's more input that kind of helps you for your kind of design decisions and things. But they're also the kind of more technical CPDs are also important as well. I think things are always changing, technology's changing, regulations are changing, so you've got to try and keep on top of that. And there's a lot to know as an architect, too much, and so you can never know everything. So it's just when you kind of feel like there's a gap in what you should know, then we'll get someone in and they can talk to us about it, basically.
You mentioned before about sort of your efforts to be more sustainable in your River House project. How do you find it, like balancing the aesthetics of a project and also the compliance side of it?
So I think for us, that's quite a key thing, and I think and actually quite a lot of our there is a kind of green aesthetic almost, but I don't think our buildings, we kind of try to avoid that. We just want to have nice buildings that happen to be very sustainable. The River House is a good example where it has, it's done kind of 10 years ago now, but it had mechanical ventilation, heat recovery, it had solar panels, it had biomass boiler at that point, where that was kind of the thing at the time, where they're kind of, heat pumps have kind of taken over from that point of view. But it is a super sustainable building, had really high levels of insulation, so it generated its own power, but it doesn't look like a typical eco house. It just looks like a nice piece of architecture. And that's kind of what we try and do with most of our projects. And some of the smaller extensions that you're more limited in what you can do with them, but more of the new build houses, you've got a lot more flexibility to integrate different systems into it. And there's different approaches. So you can some projects is more about low tech, so more kind of natural materials, really thick insulated walls, but not much technology, not much kit that you're putting into them. And others are much more, more kind of high tech, effectively. So you're using kind of latest building systems and technologies, and that is two very different approaches. I think both of them are kind of valid, but quite often kind of client led in terms of which way they want to go with it.
Is it quite refreshing to have such a nuanced approach to sustainability? You've got some high tech solutions and some low tech solutions as well. Does that keep you sort of just sticking to one?
Yeah, I think so. I think it every site is different as well. So the scope of what you can do in different places is different. So if you've got one of the projects we're just finishing at the moment, new build house out in Ditchling, it's on an amazing site with a huge grounds, and so there's loads of land that you can have a ground source heat pump in. Whereas on a tighter site that's harder to do, so that option isn't available to you. So you have to think of other ways. So obviously how the sun works is a critical part of it as well. So you need to get the fundamentals right, and some, especially if it's a retrofit project where you're working with an existing building, you can't change the orientation of the house. It faces the way it does, so you have to work with it. Whereas more of the new build ones, you can quite often manipulate that to work for you. Each project is very kind of individual, I suppose.
Is there sort of your knowledge of how adaptable you have to be in these certain situations? Does that come from work experience after uni, or would you say it's something, where do you primarily understand this, or do you have to kind of keep up to date on it through?
It's a mixture of all of it. I think we, myself and David, did for our diploma unit, we actually did biochromatic architecture. So it was quite often at part 2 at uni, you specialize, or each unit has a kind of specific thread of architecture that it specializes in. So for us, that's what we did, and so our tutor there was brilliant and got so we got a really good grounding in the fundamentals of kind of ecological design anyway, and what what the basic principles you should kind of stick to are. But then after that, it's a question of again, kit is always changing, so it's getting the kind of fundamentals right in terms of the orientation of the building, where you have your glass, where you don't want glass, getting your kind of thermal mass right, getting your kind of insulation levels up, and then it's also about what kind of keeping on top of what kind of kit is available. So solar panels, whether that's for generating electricity or generating hot water, and kind of the heat pumps coming on the scene is kind of really taking off now, and that is something that is changing. That a lot of projects are having in there, and I think the industry is trying to catch up in terms of from the supply side and the installer side of that. I think that is kind of lagging behind kind of clients' expectations and kind of need for these things. So yeah, it is tricky but you've got to kind of just try and keep on top of it as best you can, basically.
What is it like regarding costs for these like sustainable, this kind of sustainable technology? Like, is it like, does it kind of change the budget that you work with if you want to make these houses more sustainable?
I mean, lots of it there definitely is some capital outlay and it depends on what you want to go, but there is also payback in the long term as well. So again, it depends on the scale of the project, but for a new build house, having photovoltaic panels that are generating electricity with an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump makes a lot of sense, and there is that extra cost of putting them in the first place, but there is, economically it makes sense to have them
like
there.
A long-term investment.
Yeah, I think what can be tricky is all the extra consultants that you need to. So you can't just, the days of just having an architect and a structural engineer to design your house are kind of gone.
Yeah,
there's lots of other people that need to get involved as well, and so. Designing and building your own house is actually, it's quite a big undertaking. Because there's lots of different expertise that you need to bring in to satisfy planning to start with, but also, to get this thing built and functioning in the right way.
Do you work in many conservation areas? We
do, I think probably 70% of our projects are in London, and London has lots of lots of conservation areas. So, we've done lots of things in conservation areas, and also quite a few listed buildings, which is kind of a notch up again of kind of constraints. And and that quite often, especially with listed buildings, the kind of there's definitely competing kind of priorities going on there. So. We're doing a listed building at the moment where it's all single glazed, and but there's a couple of windows that we're changing. But there's the real resistance from planning to put in double glazing, or never mind even triple glazing. But from building control point of view, single glazing doesn't work. So so there's often a fight between different kind of competing wings of the council, basically.
Yeah, that sounds like a bit of a hefty challenge. I also saw on your website for Selencky Parsons that you won the British Home Award for your collaboration with Amar Francis and Foster Jenkins Trust.
Yes, yeah.
How did that come about?
It's an interesting one, but that came. The connection to that came from actually the surveyor that we have who does our measured surveys. So he knew that. So the one of the clients there has a kind of property portfolio, basically, which he is slowly kind of turning over to the trust to try and leave a bit of a legacy. He was just like, do you know any architects? So that was quite a random connection. We kind of did a proposal and a bid for that and kind of won it. But that's been like, since then, it's been a great collaboration, and we've done lots of other projects with them as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're a really interesting charity, effectively. So they've kind of focused on the arts and the sciences, and they have been providing bursaries for postgraduate students for years, basically, because there's a kind of there's help for undergraduates who are really talented but perhaps can't afford fees, but the help for postgraduates is a lot less.
Yeah.
So there was a big problem where all these talented people were having to drop out, and they were kind of being lost effectively.
Yeah.
So they created this trust and charity to kind of help those guys out, and they realized after a while that providing bursaries was great, but if people couldn't afford to live somewhere as well, then that was another really big problem.
Yeah.
And especially for their kind of performing arts students who they kind of also needed rehearsal spaces and places they could practice their instruments, or they also heavily involved in opera students, and so somewhere they could perform just either as a practice session or as kind of mini performances. So with Bravura House, which was the first project we did for them, which won the British Home Award, that was kind of almost developed as like a kind of co-living style development. So ensuite bedrooms with a series of communal spaces, and then we built a rehearsal studio in the garden as well, which is again with kind of world-class acoustic consultants working on it, so that we get the acoustics internally working really well. So it would be kind of concert standard, acoustics inside.
Was that kind of new for you? Have you done that soundproofing before?
It was new for us. So we'd never done a rehearsal studio before, but we'd kind of done other things where we had to use acousticians to help with. So I worked on a school project where we had a kind of hall that they used for assemblies and things again. So we used an acoustic consultant there. And so again, there's always a specialist for everything, and there's a consultant for everything. So we and also the client randomly happened to know the same consultant I worked on for that school, who don't normally do schools. They normally do concert halls in various capitals around the world.
Yeah.
But they kind of liked the charity as well, and so they got on board to kind of help us work up the design for the interior of the space. So it's quite an interesting process. So it's all about not having parallel surfaces and kind of breaking up flat surfaces. And so the architecture of the outside of the building, which has got this kind of asymmetric ridge that runs across it, really helps with the acoustic performance internally, but also kind of helped with planning as well, because it meant that we could have the bit that was closest to the neighbour lower.
Yeah.
So it all kind of worked quite nicely together from a kind of design and acoustic point of view.
Sounds very scientific.
It is, yeah. So and then also you had to. It was in a back garden essentially, so we had to make sure that the neighbours couldn't hear all the opera singers and the pianists playing inside. But also, they also wanted to use it for recording as well. So it had to be. Couldn't hear any planes flying over or cars on the roads from that point of view. So but it is so parts of it are super scientific, and working out how to make sure that sound isn't going to escape is a very scientific process, and then parts of it are very it's very kind of subjective and kind of creative as well. So it's that kind of blend is quite interesting. I think that's what we kind of like, I think.
Yeah. I mean, you've won like a number of awards, and you've been in the Grand Designs magazine as well. And I think you mentioned that you've been in one of the programs.
Yeah. So I think we've been on the Grand Designs program, not as one of the houses that was being followed, but as a kind of exemplar project. And a few other TV programs as well. George Clark's one. They also used one of our projects as an exemplar one, and we're about to be on a Tiny Tempers. Just been filming one of our extension projects for Extraordinary Extensions, which is about to go out. I think it was supposed to be end of September, but I think it's now like December or January. So
oh wow.
So yeah, that was quite interesting as well.
Yeah. To make sure I watch that.
Yeah.
But what kind of would you say inspires you? You know, is there any particular like architects or projects that you look up to?
I mean, there's loads, but yeah, I think that there's loads of things that that we kind of find inspiring, and I think that the more kind of input you get, the kind of more output you can kind of deliver.
Yeah, of course.
I think and then, but I don't know, one of the projects that blew me away on holiday, it was the Castle Vecchio by Carlo Scarpa, but it's like I didn't go to see it. I was just on holiday with the family, and we were kind of walking around, and it's the project I was aware of from university and stuff, and I'd seen loads of images of. But
where is this?
So it's in Verona in Italy.
Okay.
And we just walked past it. I was like, oh my God, it's there. Well, we've got to go and look at it. And we went to look at it, and it's most things when you've seen pictures of it and you see it in the flesh, you're kind of, it's never quite lives up to the what your expectations are. But this one was kind of the opposite, and it was just like, oh my God, this is amazing. But yeah, so it when you see kind of things like that, it's it's always good. Yeah.
Nice. So we actually asked our previous guest if he had a question that he thinks would be suitable to ask you, our next guest. So he said, how will AI change the profession, and could it render human architects obsolete?
Interesting. So we there's obviously quite a lot in the press at the moment about AI. So we kind of downloaded one of the programs and started having to play with it in the office. I don't think our jobs are under threat right at the moment.
Okay,
put it that way.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting in a way of using it as a tool to kind of help you generate ideas. But it's so much happens in a building. It's not, a building isn't just a picture. It's like, it's for one, it's a 3-dimensional thing, which AI kind of struggles with at the moment. It's great at generating images.
Yeah.
But then there's so many components and stuff that working together as well. So it can't leak. It's got to be thermally. It's got to work thermally. It's got to take on all the kind of desires and wishes of the client, and getting those to work together. So I think could be potentially a useful tool to, like I say, help you in the design process. But I think the time where AI is just going to design your buildings for you is not on the near horizon, as far as I can tell at the moment.
That's good news. Yeah, I mean, I remember like what you said before about sort of that collaborative work environment where you've got lots of different people sharing their ideas. I guess AI at this stage can't really mimic that. No,
it's literally a kind of, I mean, the ones that we've looked at is a kind of where the text generating thing, where you type in some text to it and it generates some images, and actually that can be quite interesting. But in a similar way to, you would look at some precedents of other buildings and go, okay, well that aspect of that's quite interesting. Could that work for this project? It essentially is another way of generating a kind of precedent image that you can use. But I think it'll undoubtedly get kind of better and better and more powerful.
So do you think before it kind of all turned sour for architects, like it could have a positive impact on your job, like make things a bit easier for you maybe?
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe in terms of, like I was saying, as a precedent thing, but I think in terms of, there's other things like, making nice images is also quite a key part of what we do. So you've got to design your buildings, but you've also got to then produce a nice image of that building to sell it to planners or clients, or to help describe that building to people. And AI can help with that. So, there's the latest versions of Photoshop have, where AI can help fill a space full of sky where you want some sky up there and you haven't got it at the moment. AI can help you do that. So it's definitely a useful tool, but it's not going to do your job for you. There's never going to, don't say never, but I find it unlikely that there'll be a button you can press and go, design a house button, done.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, that's good. I'm happy for you that that's not an issue yet. Just to sort of finish off, are there any skills or sort of mindsets that you would encourage to new architects, or perhaps kids that have just left school who are looking to perhaps do architecture at university?
Yeah, I think architecture is a kind of strange thing where it's a kind of mix of creativity and kind of technical skills, I suppose. But and there's a kind of range of different architects, some which kind of more kind of technical, and some which are more on the creative side. But for me, the creative side of it has always been the most interesting, and the technical part is helping you achieve what it needs to work. So you need the technical knowledge to help you realize your kind of creative vision, essentially. But as for someone wanting to get into architecture, I think for me, art is kind of one of the most important subjects that you should do. I think geography actually is another one, because that is all about cities and how people kind of live, which I think is key. And then quite a lot of courses will ask you for maths or something like that as well. But for me, art is the most important thing, and I think it's and architecture actually is the course is great for that anyway, because it helps the first year especially is all about trying to free up your thinking so that you're not kind of constrained on what you think what a house or a building should be. We in our first year, I think we did one of the projects was like a fashion show where we had to design a building that we could wear and that we could walk down. Another one was we had one piece of cardboard and we had to make it something we could sit on out of it. And so they're all quite kind of interesting things, but it gives you, for me, I thought it was, I loved it. I thought it was a great degree, and it gives you a really good broad kind of base in design and as a in general, and so I think you could quite easily move into different sectors from there as well.
It seems like you've really honed in on that with Selencky Parsons, how you describe yourself as a very playful sort of creative firm, that there aren't boundaries that are restricting you in that sense.
And I think one of the reasons we set up the practice was to have fun, essentially, to enjoy what we're doing, and so I think we never want to try and get too bogged down or take ourselves too seriously, but at the same time we want to do really nice buildings. So
of course,
I think we never want to get into the position where we're just knocking out stuff for the sake of earning money. We reinvent the wheel every time, which is maybe not the most efficient way to do things, but it's what kind of what keeps us interested, essentially, I guess.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for such an insightful episode. I feel like I've learned a lot. And a huge thank you to all of our listeners. We really appreciate any feedback. If you want to leave that in the comment section. And stay tuned for more captivating conversations. Once again, thank you.
No, thank
Sam.
you very much. Yeah, no, it was great.
It's been a pleasure having you on, and we hope you all enjoy this episode. Thank you all very much, and have a nice weekend.